All right, this is Obaid on behalf of V Electronics, and in this video we'll be talking about the Phillips curve as well as your contractionary and expansionary fiscal policies. Okay, so let's start off with the Phillips curve. Okay, you have number one, supply shock. So we have supply shock, and the supply shock has to do with things like, okay, the change in price of crude oil, for example. All right, or the introduction of tariffs, which may reduce or stop trade between two countries altogether. So this has to do with crude oil prices. Let's say crude oil prices, if they change because of things like conflicts. Okay, so crude oil prices. Okay, as well as things like tariffs. All right, now apart from the supply shock, okay, we know that as crude prices go up, okay, the Phillips curve will shift to the left. Okay, as crude prices go down, the Phillips curve may shift to the right. Okay, as tariffs are introduced in the market, okay, the Phillips curve may shift left, and when they're removed, it may shift to the right. Okay, so apart from that, you also have expectations that impact the Phillips curve altogether. Okay, and this has to do with expectations about what's going to happen in the economy. So if you do expect a supply shock in the future, or if you do expect the crude oil prices to go up, for example, okay, what's going to end up happening is, okay, the Phillips curve may shift right. Okay, this is if the prices are to be raised in the future. Okay, if the prices are to be brought down in the future, let's say the prices of crude oil, okay, if they go down in the future, okay, the Phillips curve may shift to the left because people will stop buying crude oil related products, okay, such as gasoline. Okay, yeah, people will end up buying gasoline when the prices go down. All right, so expectation plays a big role when it comes to the shift of Phillips curve either to the left or right. All right, now apart from these two, we also need to talk about the contractionary and fiscal policies. Okay, so contractionary and expansionary fiscal policies. So when it comes to your contractionary and expansionary fiscal policies, okay, the reason why they were important is because we talked about the expenditure multiplier. Okay, and the expenditure multiplier is used to figure out the effectiveness of the policy. The change in your real GDP is more than the change in your personal consumption or spending. Okay, so change in GDP is greater than change in personal consumption or spending. All right, so this is your expenditure multiplier, and we do know that the expenditure multiplier will impact, okay, your fiscal policies, okay, based on what the figure is over here. All right, so if it's a expansionary fiscal policy, okay, what's going to end up happening is in an expansionary fiscal policy, let's assume that this is your aggregate supply. Okay, and let's assume that this is your full potential or LRAS. And let's assume that this over here, this is your aggregate demand curve or AD. And let's call it AD0. We start at 0. Now, if you have an expansionary fiscal policy, the expansionary fiscal policy is introduced within a system to expand the economy, which means it's used to expand the economy and get the economy out of recession. Okay, so if you do have a nation that is experiencing recession, okay, you have two options. Whether you impose a monetary policy, which is imposed by the federal bank or the Central Reserve Bank, or the fiscal policy, which is imposed by the government. And the way government imposes a fiscal policy to get the country out of recession is through tax cuts. All right, so you have tax cuts and increased government spending. So we know that the tax cuts will lead to a higher aggregate demand because obviously when the taxes go down, for example, say your sales tax, if the sales tax is reduced in Ontario from 13% to 10% to 8%, the personal consumption of goods and services will go up. Okay, so personal consumption goes up as a result of which your aggregate demand will shift to the right. Okay, this will be towards full potential right over here. All right. However, if you have a contractionary fiscal policy, this is used to contract the economy. So this would be your expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, the goal of an expansionary fiscal policy is move the aggregate demand curve towards the right, towards the full potential, okay, or full employment potential, or full real GDP potential, okay, or full output potential, or the producers in a nation are able to produce at their full potential without, okay, any, um, let's just say, pressure on the way they work, okay, and contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy, or what it will do is it will move the aggregate demand curve. If this is over your long range average supply or full potential, it will move your aggregate demand curve. It will do the aggregate demand curve in a way that it shifts to the left. Okay, so it will move the aggregate demand curve to the left. So eventually, okay, when there is a recession, for example, it's possible that the producers or the, okay, people who are responsible for production may end up producing goods and services to the extent that is not sustainable. Okay, maybe because of workers working overtime. Okay, maybe because of the producers using their machines 24/7 more than the capacity of the machine. Okay, maybe because they're using too many machines or too many workers on one machine, so on and so forth. So whatever the case might be, okay, it is not sustainable. And the reason why it's not sustainable is because obviously it will lead to maintenance expenses, okay, from breakdowns, machine breakdowns, okay, you have labor strikes, okay, so on and so forth. So because it's not sustainable, because it cannot continue for a longer period of time, okay, eventually what the government will need to do is impose contractionary fiscal policy. And what this contractionary fiscal policy will do is move the aggregate supply curve towards the left to the extent where the aggregate supply, the equilibrium, okay, where the aggregate supply and the long range average supply curve will meet, will be at full potential. Okay, so your contractionary fiscal policy has to do with things like, okay, an increase in taxes. All right, so if you increase taxes, obviously what's going to happen is people will stop spending like they used to before because obviously they're spending way too much when the tax is going up. Okay, as a result of which, okay, they will wait for the tax to come back down. Okay, and they will stop personal consumption. As personal consumption goes down, because personal consumption is part of GDP and aggregate demand, your economy will be reduced. Okay, it will get contracted. So once your economy contracts, your aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. okay, to its full potential over here. All right. Now, apart from that, the government may also reduce spending. And we know that government spending, such as spending on infrastructure like highways, roads, so on and so forth, impacts GDP in a positive way, which means it increases your GDP. If government reduces spending, if the government goes ahead and reduces spending, okay, it's gonna reduce your GDP and aggregate demand, right? Because obviously, if you don't have too many roads or highways to drive, people will not have the motivation to drive, okay, because of gridlocks and traffic jams. So we know that as the government reduces its spending, the aggregate demand for products and services such as cars, vehicles, auto parts, transportation in general may go down. Okay, so a reduced government spending will lead to a contractionary fiscal policy, which means the economy will shrink, it will get contracted. Okay, so apart from that, okay, this is Obey on behalf of V Electronics. Have yourself a great day.